Troy, thank you again for joining us. With me this afternoon is Troy Ide, who co-chairs the Greenberg Trorig's American Indian Law Practice Group and represents the company, of course, in criminal and civil investigations and enforcement actions. But Troy is also a highly nationally sought mediator to resolve complex dispute issues between Indian tribes and energy companies, for example, and between tribes and state governments. And he served as Colorado's 40th U.S. Attorney, appointed by President George W. Bush. During the Obama administration, Troy was appointed to chair the Indian Law and Order Commission, which is the national advisory board to the president and Congress for strengthening public safety for all of the hundreds of federally recognized tribes in the country. Troy is also a foremost authority on water issues. And so, Troy, I want to thank you for spending the afternoon with me.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So the federal government unveiled a plan, an analysis of the Colorado River system's challenge or crisis, if you want to call it that way, probably best described as a crisis. And it really, the analysis kind of offers three paths, right? One is no action. And the two are alternative routes, if you will. And both routes entail a lot of pain for those affected by this, or are going to be affected by these proposals, more specifically the lower basin states. Now, under one kind of alternative plan, California won't be as hit as hard. And in the other plan, they kind of all share the pain, if you will. And what I'm reading here is that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the feds have been asking the 7 basin states to come up with a proposal to deal with this crisis that we have, in which we are over allocating the river. And now we're coming to a point in which the feds have basically said, if you're not gonna come up with your own proposal, we're gonna come up with a plan for you. And they didn't say which path they prefer, but I want to get your thoughts on this analysis they unveiled yesterday.
To your point, the feds are asking, and I think the asking is key as a threshold matter, because there's a debate, I'm sure, legally in many quarters as to whether the federal government actually has this authority to tell the states what to do, because there is a body, as you know, of U.S. Supreme Court law that apportions water, on which this whole framework relies. So as a threshold matter, I'm not saying that it's resolved, it's not, but I think there could be a lot of legal sparring maybe going on for years. And so the feds are asking, they're not directing. Usually, having been a Fed, we don't ask a lot, we just do things. And so that is the key threshold matter, it seems to me. So with that in mind, just a few thoughts. Number one, I think it's a good move on balance for Secretary Deb Haaland from the Interior Department and the administration to try to bring the states together on this. And I say that because, as you know, you and I were talking about this last summer, and by the end of the year, the states were supposed to have a plan, and the 7 states in the basin, you had at the end California held out, and so there was no agreement, even though the other 6 came to an agreement on some water cuts. So I do think it's a positive step for the supreme governmental power in the country to step up and say, for environmental reasons, this is their legal basis, for environmental reasons and for resource and energy reasons, we have to lead here. And leading doesn't mean being dictatorial, it means getting everyone to the table and trying to work out a compromise. That's what I understand them to be doing.
Right.
I say that authority because the National Environmental Policy Act and other statutes, you have to look at the water resource, and if the water resource is so strained that the ecosystem on which many decisions have been made in other areas of the law, unrelated directly to water rights, is not sustainable anymore, then of course there's going to be some need to look at that under various federal statutes. That's maybe the first thing. The second thing is simply the mechanism of trying to, as we'll talk about, incorporate the tribal interest. The federal government has a trust responsibility to the tribes, and there are 30 of them in the basin. to advocate for their interests and protect their interests. And so the Interior Secretary is the person who represents what we call the trust responsibility. She has the obligation to do this. So there are reasons for them to be the ones that step up and try to get all the parties together.
Yeah, if it's a nudge or an ask, it's a very strong one. It seems like it, right? Because there are two routes or two plans of attack, if you will. And the one question I do want to ask you is, which I think you touch on, does the Interior Secretary actually have the authority under one of the plans to effectively say, hey, we're not necessarily going to follow the law of the river, if you will. We're going to perhaps disregard, may not be the appropriate word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Not necessarily follow the seniority and the rights that have governed the river for 100 years or so, and say, hey, you're all going to equally share the pain here, and you know, we might do it this way.
I don't think the Secretary of the Interior, from what I can tell, has the federal law-based right to change the property allocations among the different parties. And I'm not just talking about the compact itself and what each state gets. I'm talking about all the individual holders of water rights. Those are private property interests, and the government can't impair those. That's a federal constitutional issue, as you know. So I don't think that the Interior Secretary probably has that authority, but I do think they have the authority to convene and cajole and otherwise get the parties to the table. They have levers they can pull. And as I mentioned, there are other areas of federal law where they really do have to represent the interest. Another one I didn't mention a moment ago is simply to keep these reservoirs producing hydropower. I mean, you've got them both. Meade and Powell are about less than a quarter of their capacity right now. And what that's done is reduce by about 60% at least the amount of electricity that's being generated out of those two dams, just those two. And so this is a very complex situation. The Bureau of Reclamation has the legal responsibility to make sure that that power is being generated, and yet if the water level is too low, they can't perform their statutory mission. And so when you really dig into this, you need everyone at the table, and that's really my message. I appreciate that. We need the federal government to be there, and I think to coordinate. We need the states, all of them there, and we need the tribes there. And this is a point from last time we talked. The tribes are not present, and I don't know how else to say it. And in full disclosure, I do represent the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Tribe in Colorado. I'm one of their outside attorneys, but they need to be present, and the other 28 tribes in the basin need to be present. And I don't think just being represented by the Department of the Interior, they need to be represented themselves as governments in this process. And I say that because the 1922 Colorado River Compact actually says that nothing in the compact shall interfere with their rights. But we're at the point now when we're talking about forced allocations and adjustments that their rights are going to be affected. So they need to have, I think, a seat at the table too.
It's hundreds of pages, this analysis, and I've been only beginning to like scratch the first 20, 30, 40 pages, something like that. The tribes are not in this analysis. There is what you're saying.
Yeah, and we have a U.S. Supreme Court case pending right now called Arizona versus Navajo Nation. And I represented a group called the Coalition of Large Tribes, or COLT, as a friends of the court in that, the 51 largest land-based tribes in the United States. And we supported the Navajo Nation's position, but there are many friends of the court on both sides, the state of Arizona and the Navajo Nation squaring off. Arizona doesn't want their water right to be in any way diminished in terms of their water allocation. Navajo Nation in the litigation is not seeking to have their water rights quantified. They're not fully quantified now under federal law. They want something that's pre-quantification. They want the federal government to conduct and to pay for an analysis of what their water resources are on the Navajo Nation. And they and other tribes want the federal government to do that. Now, you might think that that's something that the federal government does, but they don't. And it's pretty significant because, take, for example, Navajo, right in the heart of the basin, it's as big as the state of West Virginia. There has never been a federal study of what their water resources are. And so it's very difficult to plan for what their allocation of rights could ultimately be. And for the most part, with exception of the Utah part of the reservation. It's in 3 states. There really has not been a lot of water rights allocations yet that Congress has approved. So they're going to need that kind of information. It's going to be key to make these decisions. And I mention that because even the act of trying to figure out what tribes' water resources are is so controversial that the states have lined up, and the federal government, by the way, intervened on the side of the states against the tribes on this matter to say, no, that's not a federal responsibility. There was a really chilling part of the oral arguments in that case where Justice Gorsuch was actually asking the Solicitor General of the United States, his representative, Fred Lieu, was asking Mr. Lieu, well, does this mean, in your view of the world, could you just dam up the Colorado River so that the Navajo Nation got no water out of it at all? And the reaction from the Solicitor General was, yes, we could dam it up. They don't even see the right that they have under U.S. Supreme Court decisions to make sure that there's enough water for purposes of a reservation, which is what the U.S. Supreme Court said back in 1908 about all Indian reservations, that there must be enough water for them to have a homeland for the people who live and work there. So, we just have to get this issue in front of Congress with good facts and data. And ultimately, the Congress needs to sort this all out. Congress is the one entity that will be able to eventually determine what these allocations are. And the Interior Department can talk about forcing cuts or whatnot, but I don't think that's probably going to work legally. But I know Congress can do it, and Congress could pass a law to do it. So I'm hoping that that's where this all ends up, that you end up with a collaborative process. And to the extent that you need to get everybody at the table, Interior is taking a good first step. But the Congress is going to have to be the ones that ultimately decide what happens.
I'm going to pause for a second here so I can turn back the lights on, okay?
Didn't do that.
No. That's this light over here turns on and off automatically.
Yeah, it's an energy saving device, right?
Yeah, it's a motion something. But
you need to talk with your hands more like I do as an Egyptian. So
yeah. So just really quickly before I let you go. So how exactly can the federal government, the Interior Department is more specific, how can they bring in the tribes to this conversation? What is the practical steps they can take to actually make that happen?
Well, this has to happen actually at the president's level, I think, in the White House. There needs to be a decision that Interior and the Department of Justice no longer disagree on these issues. Interior is trying to advocate for the tribes to be at the table. Justice Department is not. That's why they were against us, the tribes, in the Arizona versus Navajo Nation case. They're on the other side. So the president's office needs to be able to make the call. And at the end of the day, I think the right move would be to get the president to support the idea that the Justice Department will start to represent the tribes and not just make spurious arguments that they have no legal rights, which they do under the U.S. Supreme Court law. And then they can go, to the extent they can't get the states to necessarily agree on everything, they can go with the tribes together to the Congress, and the Congress can ultimately sort this out. I think that's where the bus has to end on Capitol Hill, and that's where the final say needs to happen.
Is that something that's being worked on? And if yes, what are you hearing from the president's office?
I don't think so. Not very actively yet. There's a lot of pressure from tribal groups that the president needs to step in and get the Justice Department to turn around their position. But I don't think we're there yet. Also, on the larger issue, you've heard me say this before. I'm a Coloradan. I love this place. I'll be buried here someday. My family's here. I love being a Coloradan. We have to get over our phobia about ever questioning the 1922 Colorado River Compact. We have to be realistic about the fact that the measurements for the baseline of what water was to be allocated are out of date. The science has changed it. The climate has changed. We know that that the baseline is no longer accurate. And we also know that we have 40 million people along this river depending on it. And there are all sorts of interests, such as the dams that have been constructed. They're legal interests, that we need power and we need to have enough water to drive these dams and so on, and to sustain the ecosystem. That was not recognized in federal law at all in 1922, when you think about it. So we need to have a modern reassessment. And the idea, I think, is that many fear that if we ever have this conversation, Colorado will automatically lose because we're not as populous as, say, California. But I don't think that that's the right answer. I think we have to do what's best for the entire river system, and we've got to be able to work together realistically and based on good engineering and good science, and not be paralyzed. And the trouble is that everyone says they'll only go so far as to not interfere with the compact. And I just think that that gets us nowhere. And that's why I'm glad to see Secretary Holland. She's taken a lot of heat for it, but she stepped up and she's trying to get the parties together. And she has to, because otherwise one state, as California did, can veto the whole conversation.
Right, and talking about one state, big dog, if you will, vetoing the whole conversation, which we kind of saw. You saw what they did. 6 states said, "All right, well, here's a plan," and then California said, "Well, okay, whatever. Here's our plan." It seems to me that it's litigation is very likely coming from California.
Yeah, I think from other places too. But again, it's a little bit early. It's possible if you can get Interior and the Justice Department on the same page, also get the tribes on board. I think that it would not be hard to get the tribes on board. They just want to be represented, and they should be. They already have a legal right to a quarter of the water in the whole basin. It's just that out of the 30 tribes, we have about 12 of them that don't have any water allocation yet, even though by law they're entitled to one. So we need to sort that out. And most of those tribes are in the upper basin. And it's in Colorado's interest that we represent them as well, that they be represented. So,
it seems to me that human beings are really good at like figuring out a way out of a crisis, right? But we kind of have to be at the precipice of things before we actually start acting, something like that. And I feel like we are, I may be speaking out of turn, but I feel like we are at this point now. We're at the precipice, and we have this big crisis, and we need to act right now. And you mentioned that maybe we do need to revisit the compact, and we should not be afraid to perhaps and do something, modify it, if you will, and deal with the current problems that we have, because certainly, and you've heard this from several places as well, the compact may not be working as well as it should, or certainly it's probably just outdated at this point.
Well, it's also not kept pace with what's going on through other statutes, as we talked about. Let me just, I know our time is limited, but just a couple of quick examples. Many don't know that in January of this year, there was an act of Congress that actually allowed 2 tribes in the lower basin, the Colorado River Indian tribes and the Wallapai tribe, which is one of the tribes that's in the Grand Canyon, allowed those 2 tribes, which do have a water rights allocation, but their water all goes downstream. They're not able to use their water given where their people are located. They're not close to the water. There's no pipeline or whatnot. They actually will be now legally entitled to market their water to downstream users. So that means they'll be compensated for that. And that creates incentives for them to promote conservation and so on, especially at the Colorado River Indian tribes, which there is, there are areas that can be irrigated from the river in proximity to the tribe. So I mention this because we're starting to see through separate legislation, in this case, tribes being included in something that's very different from the compact. It's actually saying, here's your quantification, you have it, and also you can sell it. You can market that water to others, to non-Indians, or to anyone you want. And that's the kind of power we'd like to see for the tribes in the upper basin as well, where they don't even have an allocation yet that's legally recognized, although they're entitled to one under federal law. And 1922, none of this was known. And that is to say, the idea was the Interior Department could represent all the tribes just by being their government overlord, and the state's allocations would essentially speak for those of the tribes, even though the tribes got no water or infrastructure out of it in almost every case. So, and it's an urgent problem, like you said, and just to close on that, I mean, think about what's happening now with the San Juan River. In 1970, the Gallup water pipeline was authorized, and it was not endorsed by the Bureau of Reclamation until 1975, but it's being built now. If you drive down, between Window Rock, Arizona, and Gallup, New Mexico, you can actually see the extension. The pipeline is being built out from Gallup. Gallup has had to spend all sorts of money financing pipeline because the federal funding was not sufficient, but they actually are struggling because they're digging The water table has fallen just in the last 10 years, 700 feet. They keep having to dig new wells for the people in the area. And they keep having to export water to places like Navajo. And yet they're entitled by federal law to have something that Congress said they needed in 1970. We just have to recognize in a place like Navajo, where we've got a third of the people don't have running water, that this is a crisis. Our COVID deaths were disproportionate there by far, in part because of the lack of good housing and good water. Multifamily housing is a problem, and not having running water is the first problem in any pandemic. So it is an urgent situation.
Do you see this as perhaps the best opportunity for the tribes to be really a part of the conversation now that we're right smack in the middle of this crisis?
I think so. I think that if you had the tribes at the table and you looked across at people in California, for example, and said, hey, I don't have any running water. I was promised it by Congress in 1970, and I still don't have it. It's 2023. I think it has an impact. I honestly think not having the tribes at the table makes them almost invisible, no matter how they advocate in other manners. They're just unable to get to the right decision makers. So yeah, they need to be present. And we need to, again, not force the states. I'm not sure even legally that can be done under the current regime, as I mentioned, but we do need to do something to encourage them. And I'm glad to see that happening. So
anything else you want to add, sir?
No, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. You're gracious.
Troy, thank you again, sir. And I'll talk to you soon.
All right. We'll talk soon. Thanks for your time. Take care.
Okay. Bye for now.